Okay, أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين وبعد. So today we're going to have an extended double session devoted to Mulla Sadra, as well as then obviously any questions, which you will probably have a lot of. And so if we just pick up from where we left off, I have said that Sadruddin Muhammad al-Shirazi, or Mulla Sadra, represents the high watermark, so to speak, of Islamic philosophy. And his school is known as the school of transcendent wisdom, or in Arabic, al-hikmatul muta'aliyah. Al-hikmatul muta'aliyah. Now, Mulla Sadra was very prolific. He authored a number of works, but really his most important work for our purposes is his largest work, which is called the Kitabul Asfar. Now, the Kitabul Asfar, Asfar here is the plural of, does anyone know of Safar? So a Safar is a journey. And we say in Arabic, Safara yusafiru, he traveled, or he has traveled, or he is going to travel. So Safar is a journey, comes from that root, and Al-Asfar then means the book of the journeys. But strictly, the actual title is Al-Asfarul Arba'a. That's the shorter title by which it's known, which means, of course, the four journeys. It's also known by its fuller title, Al-Hikmatul Muta'aliya fil Asfar al-Aqliyatil Arba'a. That's the proper title. Or the Transcendent Wisdom is the main title, about or concerning the four journeys. But here it says in Arabic, Al-Asfar al-Aqliyatil Arba'a. Al-Asfar al-Aqliyatil Arba'a. So the four intellectual or the four noetic journeys. So again, the aql plays an important role. All right, this is a large book. It is a large book. It exists in two major editions now, and both editions are in 9 volumes. The older edition is printed with the comments and remarks in the form of footnotes of a number of people, the most important of which is Mulla Suhrawardi, who we've mentioned before is a 19th century figure, representative, so to speak, of this school of transcendent wisdom. And the school of Mulla Sadra continues into modern times. And so that the first edition, so to speak, the first modern edition, has not only the glosses of Suhrawardi, but also the glosses of other figures, such as the famous Sayyid Muhammad Hussain Tabatabai, known as Al-Allama or Al-Allama at-Tabatabai, or usually they drop the Al's in Persian and other languages, and in English also, they just say Allama Tabatabai. He's a very important modern figure of the school of Mulla Sadra. He's in the 20th century. He's a very interesting figure also. You can read about him. There's a biography of him in Persian called Mehr-i Taban. It's been translated into Arabic. It's by one of his students, someone who knew him. and in Arabic I think it's called Ash-Shamsu Tali'ah. And there is an English translation. I've never seen it, so I don't know if it's any good. But I remember hearing of an English translation. It's not sure under which title it's been published, but it is available on Amazon. If you do various searches, you may find it. You may find the story of his life very interesting. Because he was contemporary, he lived through the Islamic Revolution. He died a couple of years after. I don't remember when he died. Maybe it's 81 or something. But again, you could look it up. He's a very well-known figure. If you do a search on him, you'll find many, many pages. You were going to say something, Aslam?
Yeah, I have one book of his Quran.
Oh, look, there. Yeah, that's it. Is that it? Yes, yes. That's him right there. Yeah. So someone in Rayan here happened to have this book called Islamic Teachings and Overview, translated by someone named R. Campbell. Yeah, 1981. It says 1892 to 1981, and it has a photo of him. If you actually do a search on Google, you'll find many photos. He lived in modern times, so there were photos taken of him. Yeah, that's him. You said you have a book of his, a tafsir book of his?
Yeah, Quran tafsir.
I didn't know that it's been translated. Is it translated into English?
Yeah, I have one volume. Again, I bought it from a Malaysian publishing, Islamic Book Trust.
Oh yes.
And they are the Sunni publisher. They publish some of the Shia works too.
Yes, I know. I used to live in Malaysia, and so I'm familiar with the Islamic Book Trust. They do publish lots of things. He is very well known, among other things, for that book, for that tafsir called Tafsirul Mizan. It's 20-volume tafsir. And he was a scholar of encyclopedic accomplishments, but he is known primarily for his erudition in philosophy. His tafsir has these aspects in it. So his glosses are in that first published edition of the Asfar. There are other people also who have their glosses. Let's see. Who are they? There was someone named Muhammad Rida Qumshai. Muhammad Rida al-Isfahani al-Qumshai died 1304 of the Hijrah. He's a very important figure. His glosses are also there. Then in the second edition, the second published edition, it's completely different. So the first published edition is not a so-called critical edition. The second published edition was published in modern times after the founding of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and was published under government patronage, which makes it all the more surprising why it's not as good as it should be. They used manuscripts, and this is important in Islamic studies. They used important manuscripts to establish the published text. But they didn't do a good job in writing the introductions to the individual volumes. It's also in 9 volumes, so it's very hard to understand which manuscripts are which. And I have both editions. I sat down once and spent 2-3 hours trying to sort this out and made some notes on it, but it's not relevant for us. And that edition also has comments and glosses, but they put them not as footnotes, but at the end of the book, at the end of each of the 9 volumes. And there they only have the glosses of Suhrawardi. The other thing which I don't like about this edition, if you have government patronage and you're publishing this and they've obviously spent money and so on and so forth, they should have used a better font. They have used probably one of the ugliest possible Arabic fonts. And so those are the 2 editions. And no, it hasn't been translated. There are bits and pieces here and there that have been translated. I'm told that Volume 9 has been translated. Volume 9 apparently is about, or maybe it's 8 and 9, I don't remember. But that should be mainly on his theories or doctrine on the soul. And anyhow, there's some kind of a Shia seminary in London. I forget what it's. They have published that, if I'm not mistaken. But the point is that he really hasn't been translated into English, and the Asfar has not really been translated into English. Certainly not its entirety, and if what little bits and pieces are out there, they're probably not very good. Philosophical texts are very, very difficult to translate. You have to really think about it carefully. But he was very prolific. So besides this massive work, he has some other shorter works. And again, those are all in Arabic. He was Iranian, he was Persian. Persian was his mother language, he was from Shiraz, but he wrote everything in Arabic, except for one book called the Book of the Three Principles, which he wrote in Persian, which is not really a philosophical work so much as it is a kind of denunciation of decadent Sufism in his time, apparently. It's in Persian called Risala-i Asl, means the book of the treatise on three principles. Anyway, so his philosophical output, however, he has a number of other shorter works, and some of these shorter works have been rendered into English. One of them is called The Wisdom of the Throne, Al-Hikmatul Arashiyya.
We're talking about Mulla Sadra.
Yes, we're talking about
a prolific writer.
Yeah.
All this applies to him, right?
Yeah.
Got it.
So Mulla Sadra's his shorter works. This is a very short work. It was translated into English some time ago. What did I say? Al-Hikmatul Arshiyya, The Wisdom of the Throne. And this was translated by someone named James Morris. Now, he taught for many years at Exeter University. I think this may have been part of his PhD work, or his early work. And he translated that into English and wrote a very long introduction to it. I don't think this work is in print anymore, but maybe you can find it in libraries.
What is his name?
James Morris, 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 James Morris. So he taught then, after this, he taught for many years at Exeter University, and I'm not sure where he is now. Anyway. So yes, if you find that book, that's a nice introduction to Mulla Sadra, I would think. I've often looked for this book on the used book market, but I've never been successful in finding it, so... I'm sure there are copies in good research libraries. They have have at least one copy in the University of Texas at Austin for sure, and other libraries. You'll be able to find it. And so that's one of his books. Then he has another very short book, and again, in Al-Hikmat al-Arshiyya, again, his overall concern is with wujud, with being, and he has another short treatise also where he is concerned with being and the problems of being, which is called the Kitab al-Masha'ir. Now, the Kitab al-Masha'ir was translated into its entirety into French, and much of the really good work on Islamic philosophy and particularly Islamic thought, especially Shi'i thought in Iran, almost all the really interesting works, I would say even now I would consider them to be classic studies, are by Henry Corbin. And he wrote a very important, I think, 3-volume study, which, now this is his title, he called it On or Inside, I guess, Inside Iranian Islam. And that book is in French. But there is a Persian translation. And... I really wish that there was an English translation, but I don't know what's going on there. But it would be very nice if there was an English translation, if somebody would do it. But there's always issues of copyright and this and that, so who knows? But there is a Persian translation if you can read Persian. I have the Persian translation. It's very interesting and very well done, because he has quotations from original text, and so if you have the Persian translation, they went back and actually got the originals and quoted them. Yeah, so it's really a fascinating study, and as I said, it's divided into several volumes, and 4 volumes. I think I said 3. I think that's maybe actually 4 volumes, but anyhow, one volume or one whole portion of the study is devoted to the school of Isfahan and to Mulla Sadra. And so many of the really interesting studies on Mulla Sadra were done by Korban, among other topics, and he was a very prolific scholar. He also worked on Ibn Arabi. He worked on many things. And Ibn Arabi is important for understanding Mulla Sadra also. But he translated this book, the Kitab al-Mashahir. And he translated that into French. Now there is another...
A quick question.
Mm-hmm.
So, Al-Hikmat al-Arshiyah, that's the first short book, and second one is Kitab al-Mashahir.
Masha'ir.
Or Mashahir, okay.
Yeah, that's why we need a whiteboard, but
Okay.
we don't have
I'll
one.
try to get one. So the first one, the Al-Hikmat al-Arshiyah, basically discusses about one being, right?
And so does Al-Masha'ir.
For both of them? Okay.
Yes. Now there is an English translation of Al-Masha'ir. I just got it yesterday. I kind of reluctantly bought this, but I thought I should look at it. And anyway, this is again in that same series, the Brigham Young University Islamic translation series called Al-Hikmah. And this is by Sayyid Hussain Nasr. Edited, introduced, and annotated by Ibrahim Kalin, who is a kind of scholar diplomat with close ties to Erdogan. Anyhow, so this is an English translation, and it's very nice, and it's hardcover, and it has cream-colored paper and so forth. But one wonders exactly how they did this, because he's basically taken the French title. I mean, that just as a title, I don't think that works in English. The Book of Metaphysical Penetrations is somewhat peculiar. Anyhow, other issues could be raised, but it's not our topic. Just want to make you aware of what's out there. There is a translation that was done before this also of the Kitab al-Mashahir by Parviz Murawij. And that really was an awful job.
But he probably subcontinent people.
No, he's not subcontinent. He's a very capable Iranian gentleman. And I don't really understand. He had a very amazing, I thought very interesting book on Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina also wrote in Persian, and he wrote a kind of encyclopedia of philosophy, sort of like a smaller shifa in Persian called the Danish Namaye Alai. And Parviz Murawij did an English translation of the metaphysics portion of that, and so it's called the Metaphysica of Avicenna. And it has really good introductions and comments, and he really did a lot of work. I thought that was a really, I still think it's a very useful book. He seems to be kind of an Iranian nationalist, though. I mean, seems, I said, when you read between the lines, because he says sort of these sorts of things about the copula, and how Arabic doesn't have the copula, and how Ibn Sina uses the word hasti, which is the Persian equivalent of wujud, but he also uses the word wujud, so maybe he meant something else. And so there's a lot of this kind of stuff in the book, but it's a very interesting book. So I was surprised when I saw that his translation was so bad. Maybe he, he just didn't have a lot of time to do it. Maybe he was ill. It was obviously a work of, in his old age, probably. I don't know. Anyway, whatever it is, it's not a very useful translation, and it is out of print now. Not surprisingly, I suppose. I don't know. Anyhow, so that's really what you've got in English when it comes to Mulla Sadra. I think there is another book, which is a more, strictly speaking, mystical, Irfani treatise called Iksirul Arifin. That's translated by William Chittick. William Chittick is a seasoned translator. And
Irfan al-Arifin.
Iksirul Arifin. Iksirul, Alif, Kaf, Sin, Ya, Ra. Iksirul Arifin. And that also is available in this Brigham Young Al-Hikmah Islamic Philosophy Translation series.
What is this book about? The Iksir Arifin. I know it's about gnosis sort of, but...
Yeah. Honestly, I have never read this book. But I know that it's based on a Persian treatise by, I think, someone named Baba Afzaluddin Kashani. And he sort of writes an Arabic version of that. That's my understanding, but I've never actually read the book. And that wouldn't be surprising. I think that figure is a person of interest for William Chittick as well. And I think he's, so people translate what they translate. And But the common denominator between Chittick and Hussein Nasr is that they're both followers of Fritjof Schuon, who was a very problematic figure. The perennialists, and so is Kalin, Ibrahim Kalin. Anyway.
Is even William Chittick a permanent philosopher? I mean, does he accept that notion? I haven't read.
Well, I mean, he's not here for us to ask him, but generally speaking, that's what the only conclusion you can really draw on the basis of his written works and his network and who he's associated with, and they're all associated with Sayyid Hussein Nasr, and Sayyid Hussein Nasr's allegiances are well known,
yes,
and on record, and. So that's the thing. So there seems to be a fascination among the so-called perennialists, who also are known as the so-called Maryamiyya. They have a fascination with Mulla Sadra and Ibn Arabi and so forth, because as they do with the Suhrawardi, because they think that somehow it supports their master's doctrine of the so-called transcendent unity of religions. Schuon has a book on that. But we are digressing. Let's get back to the topic. So that's Mulla Sadra's, what's available on Mulla Sadra in English. There are some studies of Mulla Sadra in English as well. And there's really only three really, I think, good ones that are really worth the time. Because now Mulla Sadra is becoming something like Ibn Arabi. It's becoming like an industry. You can just write on him because there's an interest in it. All right. So, but there's three, I think, wallahu alam, important works on the topic, and really the first book that really tried to deal with Mulla Sadra, and in a very source-based way, based on the original sources in Arabic, was by the very learned Pakistani scholar Fazlur Rahman, who taught at the University of Chicago. Now, I think he had a lot of ideas which I certainly disagree with, and probably many of you would as well. But he was someone who was educated in the traditional system, and he really knew the Arabic language well. You see, if you don't know the language, and the honest truth is many so-called scholars, many so-called big names really don't know the language, who work on Islamic studies in the West. Yeah. Well, Fazlur Rahman wasn't one of them. So in his book, he devoted to Mulla Sadra, it's called The Philosophy of Mulla Sadra. He actually goes through the whole Asfar. He reads through the whole Asfar. It's obvious he's read through the whole 9 volumes. I mean, it's not something you can fake, and the footnotes are there, and you can. No, it's not fakeable, right? People are laughing, yeah. So Mulla Sadra, if you really want to understand him, yeah, you can read these smaller treatises and so forth, but at some point you've really got to sit down and read the Asfar. All right, now that's going to take you a while. Well, in his office there at the Oriental Institute in Chicago in the freezing cold weather, I'm sure, Chicago is awful weather if you've ever been to Chicago, especially the winter.
Yeah, I've been.
I lived there for 2 months, and then I said, forget it, I'm going back.
I lived for a week.
So you can see how he was obviously a very diligent person, but the weather would have helped. Just stay in your office and read. So he wrote a comprehensive work, and I think it's a dense book. I don't think it's an easy book to read, but this is really a very comprehensive and pioneering work. It was no work on him really of that magnitude that really was based on close and careful reading of Mulla Sadra. And moreover, Fazlur Rahman was quite well qualified to do this because he was a specialist in philosophy. He was a specialist in Ibn Sina. And he, in fact, produced a critical edition of Ibn Sina's work on the soul. And he even did a translation of the soul, or the psychology section, of Ibn Sina's much smaller work, the Kitab al-Najat, in English. And you can actually find a PDF. Kitab al-Najat. There's a book by Ibn Sina called Kitab al-Najat, which is a kind of summary of the Shifa. It's a short, and so yes, Fazlur Rahman translated the portion on the soul, and he also did a critical edition in Arabic. of the Shifa section devoted to the soul. So he's in a very good position to understand Mulla Sadra, because, as I've tried to emphasize in this class, if you really want to understand Islamic philosophy, you have to have some understanding of Greek philosophy. Otherwise, it will be very difficult for you. Yeah, and once you've got some understanding of Greek philosophy, particularly Aristotle, you need to understand Ibn Sina, because everything that comes after, it all builds on Ibn Sina, And so Fazl Rahman was in a good position. So that's a very good book. And I was told that it's back in print, because it went out of print. And if you find even some old original edition, it's going to be a very expensive book. But if it's back in print, that would be marvelous. I have a photocopy I made somewhere, years ago, and it's a very useful book to refer to. All right, so that's one book. Then there is a book called The Act of Being, The Philosophy of Revelation in Mulla Sadra, by Christian Jambet. Jambet is a student of Corban. And this book was translated from the French. And this book is also still in print, and you can easily get a copy of it if you feel so inclined.
What is the translator?
Christian Jambet. It's called The Act of Being, The Philosophy of Revelation in Mulla Sadra. Okay, then finally, there is a book by my esteemed colleague and friend, Sayyid Sajjad Rizvi, who teaches at Exeter. It's called Mulla Sadra and Metaphysics, Modulation of Being. Okay.
Sajjad Rizvi.
Yeah. Now, this is published by Routledge. The Routledge books are usually expensive. Yeah, I didn't have to buy this. This was given to me. Signed by the author. So. All right. So these are three important books. And the last one, which is the Sajjad Rizvi book, is really a study of one important concept or one important doctrine in Mulla Sadra, which is called the doctrine, which he translates as modulation of being, or what in Arabic is called tashkikul wujud. And this is a very important doctrine in Mulla Sadra, and in the opinion of Sayyid Sajjad, it's the heart of the system. And he makes an extended study of this, stretching over some 130 odd pages or so. This is a well-written book, but it also, none of these books really are an easy read. It's a difficult topic. You have to sort of focus.
Yeah.
It's not the kind of book you can sort of relax and read, lying down. I suppose you could, but I mean, it's, regardless of whether you're sitting down, lying down, you have to really concentrate when studying this kind of thing. So, Mulla Sadra's major work, as I said, is the Kitab al-Asfar. And these other works of his are somewhat derivative. Now there are, what did I mention? So we've mentioned the Kitab al-Hikmat al-Arshiyya, we've mentioned Mashaa'ir, Iksir al-Arifin came up, Risalat Si Asl came up, and then there's also a couple of more books we should mention. He has a book called Ash-Shawahid al-Rububiyyah. This is a very interesting book. And he has also Kitab Ash-Shawahid al-Rububiyyah.
What is it about?
Well, all of his books touch on wujud in some way or another, and they're all of these shorter books are in some degree or another derivative of the Asfar. And this book and another book called Kitab al-Mabda wal-Ma'ad, the book of the origin and the return, are somewhat similar. And they emphasize some topics over others more than others. But the Shawahid al-Rububiyyah is particularly interesting because it's almost a kind of summary of the Asfar in a way. And there's a huge modern commentary on it by Sayyid Jalaluddin Ashtiani, and that also has a commentary it's a commentary by Mullah, excuse me, there's a huge commentary on it by Mullah Hadi Sabzavari, edited by Sayyid Jalaluddin Ashtiani. And Ashtiani, whenever he edits, he would also have his notes, but the major glosses are by Sabzavari. So the major sort of expositor of the school after Mulla Sadra, in terms of his writings and his production, it really seems to be Sabzavari. I mean, there are other figures, but Sabzavari is particularly, he's much later, but he's very prolific. And in terms of, in modern times, I told you there's Allama Tabatabai. He also wrote works based on the system of, works summarizing or representing the school of Mulla Sadra. One of them is called Bidayatul Hikmah, and I think that's translated into English. And then one's called Nihayatul Hikmah, the beginning of wisdom and the end of wisdom. And Ashtiani, Sayyid Jalaluddin Ashtiani is also an important figure, and he really is a person who edited many of the important works of falsafa and irfan in the 20th century. So I've taken a lot of time just to give you these names because they're so unknown outside of the world of, traditional Islamic studies. And I don't know what's going to happen. Maybe some of you will go on, you will learn languages, you will go and read these people. I don't know. We often don't know what's going to happen. So I often say that, I hope you found this course useful, but you probably won't know whether it's useful or not until 10 or 20 years from now, right? So who knows what's going to happen. So I'm just putting this out there. These are important figures, and they're very, they deserve to be more widely known. And the only way they're going to be more widely known is if more people learn the necessary languages and they go and they read them and then translate them or write works about them. As everybody is not going to be able to learn Arabic, so it's not just that we have a lot of reading to do; we have a lot of translating to do. So the field is wide open. Okay. Now, the substantive content. Mulla Sadra is an extremely important figure, as I said in the last class, because he synthesizes everything that comes before him. And there are a number of key elements which he has synthesized and which are very important to remain aware of. So perhaps the most important in this list of key elements, I think there will be 5 of them, is the philosophy of Ibn Sina. Why is this so? Well, Ibn Sina not only establishes many of the questions, but he also, bequeaths to posterity a kind of philosophical language and so forth, which was existed to some degree, but then it becomes kind of standard after him. And so it's not just the language, but it's also many of the problems, and philosophy is really defined by its problems. And so he analyzes a number of questions and then sort of bequeaths those answers to posterity, and people keep thinking about them. So if you really want to understand Mulla Sadra, you've got to understand that this is one important element in his philosophy as well. So the whole discussion of, for example, substance, accident, being, quiddity, the categories, all of these things are there in the metaphysics in the Kitab al-Shifa of Ibn Sina in some way or another. So the philosophy of Avicenna, I would say, is the first key element in the synthesis of Mulla Sadra. Now, another key element is the Shi'i theology, the 12-verse Shi'i theology of Nasiruddin al-Tusi. Tusi is another extremely important figure. So, Tusi died in 672. In other words, about 240, almost 250 years, right, after the death of Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina died in 437. And Nasiruddin al-Tusi wrote a very influential and important commentary on one of the works of Ibn Sina, namely كتاب الإشارات والتنبيهات. And Nasiruddin al-Tusi also wrote an extremely influential work on 12-er Shi'i theology called Tajreed al-I'tiqad, which has a very large number of commentaries on it. And if you are familiar with his commentary on the Isharat, then you can see that some of the issues which are there in the Isharat are also alluded to in the Tajreed al-I'tiqad. And in fact, you will find that some of the ideas which are later very prominent and elaborated in Mulla Sadra are there in the Tajreed al-I'tiqad. And in the commentary on the Tajreed al-I'tiqad by Nasiruddin al-Tusi's student, Al-Allama al-Hilli, he wrote a very important commentary. It's really the most important commentary, I think, on the Tajreed, which is Kashful Murad. It's not the largest commentary. It's actually a manageable size, about 600 pages. But it's the most important. And I really think that if he didn't write this commentary, nobody else would have been able to understand what Nasiruddin al-Tusi was saying in the book. And you don't understand why I'm laughing, because without a commentary, it's such a difficult book. The Tajreed al-I'tiqad is only about, 30, 40, 50 pages, depending on the font size and so forth. But it's not a large, it's a matan, really. And it is a really difficult book if you don't have a commentary.
So the Kashful
Murad. Kashful Murad.
Who is the author of that one?
Allama Hilli. Allama Hilli. So the Tajreed al-I'tiqad is divided into sections, and the first section is about being and non-being, al-wujud wal-adam, and then the next section, it's actually divided into 6 investigations. The first investigation is on being and non-being, and the second investigation concerns substance and accident. Now, this is extremely significant because he really begins his whole business on theology with discussing wujud in very much the way that Ibn Sina does. Wujud cannot be defined. Wujud doesn't have genus or species. Wujud is utterly simple. Wujud and thinginess are coextensive. A lot of the sort of things which we read in our extract from Ibn Sina. And again, you will find these same things, but more investigated at greater length in Mulla Sadra. Now, what is also very important is that Nasiruddin al-Tusi had been in contact with extremely important figures from the school of Ibn Arabi. Now, Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi is one of the most important figures in Islamic thought, particularly when we talk about irfan or Sufism, mysticism. And he had a very close disciple who also was his stepson, named Sadruddin Qunawi. Sadruddin Qunawi and Nasiruddin al-Tusi had an exchange of letters, a correspondence. Now you must keep in mind that Sadruddin Qunawi is a Sunni Muslim. Nasiruddin al-Tusi is a Shi'i Muslim. But they had this correspondence where they were talking about and discussing about being, wujud. It's a very interesting correspondence. It survives in manuscripts. There are 2 editions. There's an edition published in Iran, and there's also an edition published by the German Oriental Institute, or the Orient Institute in Beirut. Again, these are all in Arabic. There's no translation. But the point is that he was aware of these people, of this figure, and they had a correspondence. And that's also very significant because the third person I would put on the list as a major influence on Mulla Sadra and an element in the synthesis of Mulla Sadra is Muhyiddin ibn Arabi. Mulla Sadra, in fact, has many quotations. He quotes people who came before him. And in that way, the Kitab al-Asfar is a huge repository of quotations, actually. Quotations and paraphrases from everybody who comes before. I mean, you would have to compile a large index. And this is another problem with the modern edition. The so-called critical edition doesn't have a good index of these things. And anyway, not to complain further, but the Asfar is just full of quotations from previous authorities. And the person that Mulla Sadra quotes the most, and I think this is very easy to see. I mean, I didn't go through all 9 volumes and keep a tabulation, but it's not that hard, because when you read through, you will find, it's immediately apparent, that the person he's quoting the most, really, is Ibn Arabi. He quotes from the Fusus al-Hikam, he quotes from a lot from Ibn al-Arabi's famous book, Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah, and he quotes him approvingly. And keep in mind that Muhyiddin ibn Arabi is a Sunni Muslim and Mulla Sadra is a Shi'i Muslim. Although, when you start looking at these kind of deep and profound philosophical questions, this whole business of Sunni and Shi'i becomes somewhat irrelevant.
Yes.
Because they're not really talking about the Khilafah and, differences in Islamic law and the kinds of typical polemical issues that come up between Sunnis and Shias. They're talking about philosophical problems which even non-Muslims have looked at. Right? But it's fascinating to see how Mulla Sadra was himself fascinated by Ibn Arabi. So Ibn Arabi is a major influence. So we have the metaphysical doctrines of Avicenna. We have the metaphysical doctrines as summarized by Nasiruddin Tusi, and he considers them to be part and parcel of Shi'i theology. And then you have Ibn Arabi, who again is very well known for, or is chiefly known almost, for his doctrine of Wahdat al-Wujud. But Ibn Arabi is known for other things. There's the doctrine of Wahdat al-Wujud, the unity of being. There's the doctrine of the theophany of the divine names, and the doctrine of the perfect man. These are 3 fundamental doctrines or teachings in Ibn Arabi, and all of them have profound resonances in the Shi'i world and in Shi'i thought, theology, mysticism. That's one reason that Ibn Arabi, despite the fact that he's a Sunni Muslim, was extremely well received in the Shi'i world, and all the commentaries on the Fusus al-Hikam, all the major ones, the one by Sadruddin Qunawi, the one by Jandi, the one by Kashani, the one by Qaisari, are all published in Iran and available in Iran. And they're not available in the Arab world. There's only the commentary of Kashani that is really well known in the Arab world and sort of floats around and is published and so forth. And more important than that, the commentary by Qaisari is taught in some circles in the Shi'i traditional Hausa or the traditional Shiite seminaries. And the most important edition of the commentary of Qaisari on the Fusus al-Hikam is also published in Iran, with also the massive notes of Jalaluddin Ashtiani and other figures. Like this person I mentioned to you, Qumshai is there, a lot of people. Anyway, so Ibn Arabi is an important part also of this synthesis. The 4th name, which we would have to include here in the synthesis of Mulla Sadra, is someone named Shihabuddin Suhrawardi al-Maqtul. Now, a lot of people, they just call him a Suhrawardi, and that causes confusion because there is another famous Suhrawardi, and he also was named Shihabuddin Suhrawardi. And he's the founder of the famous Suhrawardi Sufi Tariqa. But these are 2 different people. So the Suhrawardi I'm talking about is Shihabuddin Yahya as-Suhrawardi. And the other Suhrawardi who founded the Sufi Tariqa is Shihabuddin Omar Suhrawardi. Moreover, the person I'm talking about, Shihabuddin Yahya ibn Habash ibn Amirak as-Suhrawardi, who is known also as al-Maqtul, or a Suhrawardi al-Maqtul, or a Suhrawardi al-Shaheed even. Suhrawardi, the one who was killed, Suhrawardi the martyr, died, or was actually was executed, in Aleppo in 587 of the Hijrah, corresponding to 1191 of the Common Era. He is a fascinating and, I think, very neglected figure.
Why Salahuddin, right? Executed.
Salahuddin didn't directly execute him, but he became close. He was in Aleppo, and he became a kind of, or he was seen to be a kind of influence on the son of Salahuddin, and then so under pressure, he had him executed. Yes. The fact is, he was a very very learned and erudite person, and he was very it would seem that he had a lot of charisma. Obviously it's very hard. You read these accounts, and we weren't there, but what seems to have happened is that he became a figure that the other scholars of the time who were vying for kind of influence with the rulers became very jealous of. And this is an unfortunate thing in the history of Islam, that when sometimes this has these kind of instances arise, then people cook up things about people. And he was accused of claiming to be a prophet, or claiming that there's all sorts of charges. And if you actually read, this is what people don't do. Most people, they know the name, but they don't have the books. And if you actually look, he doesn't say anything like this. I'm sure that from a strict sort of Ash'ari, Maturidi, Sunni, Salafi, Hanbali, whatever position, you could probably find lots of things that you wouldn't like if that was your proclivity. But claiming to be a prophet or something like this is just not one of them. So, what is he known for? Well, he is known for a kind of illuminative mysticism, and that's encapsulated in the title of his his most important work would be a work called Hikmatul Ishraq. Now, we are more fortunate in the case of Suhrawardi that a lot of his works are translated into English. And so Hikmatul Ishraq, or the Wisdom of Illumination, is translated into English, and you can buy it in the Brigham Young University Islamic Translations Philosophy Series. He had a number of shorter texts also in Persian. He also was very prolific in Persian. And Korban was fascinated by him. And Korban wrote a lot about Suhrawardi. Now, it is really worth reading the volume that is devoted to Suhrawardi in Henry Corbin's book, Inside Iranian Islam, has been translated by someone into English. Just some admirer of his. And he's put it up on the web for free, and you can download it.
What is that?
It's called Inside Iranian Islam, Suhrawardi and the Persian Platonists. Because that's that's his English translation of the relevant French volume by Corbin devoted. And that's a very interesting read. So Suhrawardi is known as Shaykh al-Ishraq, or the Shaykh, or the Master of Illumination. And so he espoused a kind of illuminative wisdom, heavily imbued with the symbolism of light. And he was of the opinion that there was an ancient kind of primordial wisdom. This is another reason that the Shuanites, the perennialists, the Maryamiyya, whatever you want to call them, are fascinated. And of course, Shuan probably never heard of him. It's his disciple, Sayyid Hussein Nasr, that introduces that band of people to Suhrawardi. So Suhrawardi believed that there was a kind of primordial wisdom which all of the ancient sages taught. And he considered these ancient sages to be also the ancient sages of Greece, as so when you talk about Greece, he's not saying something new in that region or in the milieu of Islamic society. He's dying in the 6th century Hijra. He's executed in the 6th century of the Hijra. There's already been all this translation and encounter with Greek learning. But what he's saying is that the same thing applies to the ancient Persian sages. Zoroaster, for example. There was this current also in ancient Greece and in the ancient world, that the Persians also had some sort of ancient wisdom. And in fact, some of these ancient Greek philosophers from Alexandria, Plotinus himself, actually wanted to travel to Iran to study there at the time. There were contacts between ancient Greece and ancient Persia. There were wars. There was all sorts of things. There was also some kind of cultural awareness of each other. Anyhow, so Suhrawardi says that original teaching of Zoroastrianism also is part of this traditional wisdom. And you have to understand then that correct or true original Zoroastrianism is not a dualism on that view. And so Suhrawardi is of this opinion that he is a kind of confluence of these two streams of wisdom. You understand? So he's trying to present a kind of, and for him, you see, Islam is the next and the last and final iteration of this wisdom. So his works have a lot of references, direct and indirect, to this ancient wisdom, and also to ideas from Zoroastrianism, and there's even terms, ancient Persian terms that he uses and so forth. So you can see that, if you want to declare this guy to be problematic, there's ample material there. But it's obvious that the guys who did it never read his books. They just didn't like him because, he was popular, apparently, with the ruler. And so they just cooked up the simplest way, I think, to defame him. So for Suhrawardi, mystical experience is this direct illumination. And anyhow, so these ideas are also there in Mulla Sadra. All right? So you can see that we're really just listing these names, and this is a very simplistic sort of approach. You could obviously do a whole course on each one of these figures. But Mulla Sadra was a serious reader of all of these figures. And in fact, it's surprising that he doesn't have a commentary on the Fusus al-Hikam, unless, or Ibn Arabi, unless you consider his whole school to be a kind of footnote to Ibn Arabi, which would be a stretch. I don't think it is. But it's fascinating to me that Mulla Sadra has extended glosses and extended commentary on the Kitab al-Shifa, the Metaphysics of the Shifa of Ibn Sina, and glosses on the Hikmat al-Ishraq of Suhrawardi as well. He doesn't have any kind of commentaries on any of the books, like he doesn't have any commentary on the Tajrid al-I'tiqad of Nasiruddin Tusi, but obviously he's aware of these things, and if you read these books closely, you can see what is common, and there is commonality. So that's the fourth person?
Yeah, so
that's the fourth influence? Yeah, and there's one more. Yeah.
Mulla Sadra had extensive commentary on Ibn Sina's work, as well as on...
Well, it's not really an extensive commentary. It's what are called ta'liqat. They're glosses. Okay. Glosses, like footnotes, marginalia. But they're important. So they're little brief comments on things in Ibn Sina's Shifa. But those brief comments, they fill a whole book. Okay. Yeah. I mean, typically, you understand what people would do is they would have the book, and as they were reading it, they would write a ta'liq. Ta'liq means something hanging, just something in the margin or between the lines they would write there, or they would maybe have some other sheet of paper, and by then they were using paper. It really wasn't parchment. They were using paper. And while he's reading, he'll say, well, I'm going to make a comment on this paragraph, and then he'll write something like, قَوْلُهُ And he'll put the head word, the beginning of the paragraph he's commenting on, and then he'll write, a paragraph or two or a page or two, then he'll keep reading, and he'll do another, and by the time he's done, he's got a little book. So that's what people would do. And if you actually start studying Islamic manuscripts and you find manuscripts that were used by people as textbooks or people who are just reading or people who are teaching a book, you'll find comments all over the margins. That's how people did things in those days. And then, that's really what it meant to study a book. You would go and you wouldn't have the book. You'd be lucky if you could buy a copy. And there were book dealers and so forth. And then or if you were very wealthy, you would have one copied for yourself. If you could afford that. Or, as many people did, they copied their own. And as they would copy, if they were diligent, they would leave spaces in between. And then you have room to write in between the lines. And this is how books were made. It's really a much better system, I think. Yeah. Than the modern way of doing things.
Excellent question. So he had Mulla Sadra footnotes on Shifa as well as Nasruddin Tusi's work.
No. He didn't comment on Nasruddin Tusi. It's the Shifa of Ibn Sina, right? And the Hikmat al-Ishraq of Suhrawardi.
Okay.
And then I said, I don't know of any, we don't come across any commentaries on the Tajweed al-I'tiqad of Nasruddin al-Tusi. I wish he had. We don't come across, commentaries on Ibn Arabi, unless you take, what he said in the Asfar, and he quotes and he comments, so you could construe it that way, but he doesn't have a dedicated set of glosses or commentaries on Ibn Arabi. Okay? He does, and this brings us to the fifth influence, he does have a very extended commentary, and this is a commentary, not a gloss, but it's incomplete. For whatever reason, he didn't finish it. People would start things, or maybe he didn't intend to write a whole commentary anyhow. But he has an extended commentary, which is not finished, it's an incomplete, on the Usul al-Kafi, which is a very important book of hadith in the Shia world. Now, people sometimes make the analogy and they say, it's like the Bukhari of the Shias, but that's a very misleading statement. If you want to say it's like Bukhari for the Shias in the sense that it has an important status, then you are right. But nothing more than that. They don't have this idea that everything that in Al-Kafi is correct, as many Sunnis do about Bukhari. That also is not really a nuanced view, but that is the general opinion among many Sunni people, even scholars, that whatever is in Bukhari is reliable or correct or sahih or what have you. That's not the view about Al-Kafi. But Al-Kafi does have a similar importance. So he wrote at length on the opening books of Al-Kafi. And Al-Kafi, that's Kitab al-Aql wal-Jahl. There's a Kitab al-Ilm and there's Kitab al-Hujjah. So, and Kitab al-Hujjah is, about the Imam. The Imam is Hujjah. The Imam is proof. Anyhow, this is an important book. Very important book for understanding Mulla Sadra. Mulla Sadra also has a tafsir, which is, they call it the tafsir of Mulla Sadra, but it's actually a tafsir on selected parts of the Quran. It's also not a full tafsir all the way from Al-Fatiha all the way to Surah Qul A'udhu Birabbin Nas. No, it's not like that. So he's a very prolific person. And the fifth influence then, obviously, from this example is clear. It should be clear to you that he is heavily influenced by the statements of the Imams of the Shia and particularly some of the more philosophical things that they said. So one finds elements of that as well. So these are the 5 key influences. Ibn Sina, the metaphysics of Ibn Sina, the theology and metaphysics of Nasruddin al-Tusi, the illuminative mysticism or wisdom of Suhrawardi, the Wahdat al-Wujud, or the unity of being doctrine, which you find in Ibn al-Arabi, and the teachings of the Shiite Imams in the Shia Hadith. Those are key influences. Now, in addition to all that, if you actually start looking through the Asfar, he's read everybody that's come before him. He's read, the disciples of Ibn Sina like Bahman Yar. He's read, he has made a reading of the Aeneids of Plotinus. He refers to some of the ancient Greek sages. One place in passing he mentions Greek astronomy. There's all sorts of interesting references in Mulla Sadra. And Mulla Sadra, surprisingly, now I did say he's difficult to read, but his Arabic is beautiful. It's the ideas, the language is very clear. He wrote very good Arabic. The ideas, the doctrines might be difficult, but Mulla Sadra really is a pleasure to read.
When did Mulla Sadra die?
Oh, he died in 1041. Sorry, he died in 1050, excuse me. He died in 1050. It was Mir Damad who died, his teacher, in 1041. All right, so now that we understand these influences, we now come to the major sort of problem which confronts Mulla Sadra. That is the problem of being.
Did he also read about Indian philosophy, Vedas, Upanishads?
It doesn't look like it. Not that we know of. So Mulla Sadra's two major teachers are Mir Damad and Bahauddin al-Amili, and we're more interested in Mir Damad, who died in 1041. Mir Damad is also, like many figures in Islamic history, many learned figures, he is a man of encyclopedic learning, and he was a profound scholar of both the rational and the transmitted sciences. And it would appear that he is the first person really to look at the problem in this way. I say it would appear because we're not really certain. But there is a large book, a large modern study and an exposition of the doctrines and teaching of the school of Mulla Sadra by someone named Abdul Rasul Ubudiyat. Abdul Rasul Ubudiyat. Now, he wrote the book in Persian.
How come such a name? Abdul Rasul.
Abdul Rasul is actually a common name before the modern period and influence of Salafist lunacy.
Oh, is it?
Yeah. You find it in different forms. You find, for example, in India and Pakistan, in South Asia, you find the name Ghulam Nabi, Ghulam Rasul, which is the same as Abdul Rasul. There was also the famous, and the great paradox is the guy was probably a Salafi. There was a famous, figure in the so-called Afghan Mujahideen named Abdul Rasul Sayyaf. Maybe that can't be before your time, Aslam. Surely you were around during the whole business with the Soviet Union and all that. So a lot of people in Afghanistan have that name.
But not because of this. I'm saying generally, at least what I learned, understood, really, some of the works is Islamic, that is, I'm putting in quotation based on my understanding. Islamically, we cannot name a person as other than Allah's whatever names or attributes, right? So beyond that, it's not acceptable. So if somebody's name is Abdul Masih, that has to be changed.
Well, Abdul Masih is a Christian name.
Yeah,
it's only used among Christians. You'll never find it.
It's not acceptable to Muslims because of same Abdul Rasul is similar name.
Yeah. Well, you can request a fatwa on that. That's not our topic. I can't do anything about the guy. That's his name. And I was trying to look through my notes. I don't seem to have the details about the book that he wrote, but I have an Arabic translation of the book that he wrote in Persian on the system of Mulla Sadra. And he is a modern scholar of Al-Hikmat al-Muta'aliyah, and in a footnote, he explains that I think I'll get you the information and I'll give you in our second session. We're at 1:20 now, so we'll go until 2. But he mentions that the problem is really first formulated by Mir Damad, Mulla Sadra's teacher, in this way. And the problem really is, well, we have wujud and we have mahiyya, right? And this is a distinction which is made conceptually. It is made in the mind. Then the question arises that, well, what is more fundamental, if any, in the external world? That's pretty much where we left it last time. And now we've gone over all of the sort of background of Mulla Sadra, the historical and his works and so forth. And now we're getting back to the philosophy. That's where we left it last time. So out of those two, what is more fundamental or more real, more fundamental in the external world? Is it wujud or is it mahiyya? Now, there are statements in Ibn Sina which can be interpreted either way. It doesn't seem that Aristotle comes down one way or the other. It's hard to know, unless you know Greek and all this and spent your life studying Aristotle, which I have not. So I'm just going to leave that to the side. In terms of Islamic studies, Islamic philosophy, you don't find things presented that way in Ibn Sina. And this is the question of asalatul wujud or asalatul mahiyya. Which is more fundamentally real in the external world? Asalatul wujud says that wujud is more fundamentally real in the external world. And asalatul mahiyya would be the position that quiddity is more real in the external world. But it doesn't seem that this issue was presented in this way, or that this dichotomy was directly presented in those terms before Mir Damad. That's what Abdul Rasul Abudiyat says. And I remember when before I knew Arabic and so forth and learned of these things just from secondary sources, when I learned Arabic, I was looking for that. I said, you don't really find this. I mean, what are these people talking about? Where is it really formulated that way? So it would seem that it was Mir Damad, according to Abdul Rasul Abudiyat in this book, and he references some of the collected treatises of Mir Damad where this problem is put forward in this way. So it doesn't seem to be a question that's discussed in this way, except in Isfahan, in the school of this is the school of Isfahan period, in the Safavid period. And then they say that, well, it's the people who were before, and it would seem that, and Mir Damad is certainly upholding the position of the fundamental reality or primacy of quiddity in the external world. And it would appear then that this was also the position of Suhrawardi. That's important. And
As per Abdul Rasul.
Suhrawardi Maqtul.
I know.
This is not as per Abdul Rasul. This is according to Mulla Sadra also, because he has in his different works refutations of the position of the Suhrawardians, the illuminationists, if you like. But there too, one wonders if this is not a kind of anachronistic, retroactive sort of reading back into history these positions, because also he doesn't espouse it in those terms. Again, that the terms of the debate seem to be there from Mir Damad as per Abdul Rasul Abudiyat. At any rate, that's how also Mulla Sadra is dealing with the question. Okay? So there are four logical possibilities. If we formulate the question this way, and if we say that, well, in the external world we are only confronted by mawjudat, by substances, to use Aristotle, jawahir in other words, and we are, in other words, confronted only by quiddities in the external world. In concrete terms, we only encounter existing things. When we subject them to a process of analysis, then in the mind, we are able to distinguish quiddity from being, and being from quiddity. So naturally the question arises that, well, in the external world, is it really these quiddities that are the fundamental reality that are truly real, truly more fundamental, or is it being? And Mulla Sadra says that to say that it's quiddity is a mistake, and in fact it is being, which is more fundamental. Now, that position is also somewhat counterintuitive, because in our day-to-day lives, we encounter individual human beings, we encounter tables, chairs, cars, automobiles, trains, planes, right? We encounter individual entities or quiddities. And Mulla Sadra says that's the whole mistake. What really we should see, and it's not just a question of conceptual elaboration and of just arguing about it, it's also a kind of mystical insight into the nature of things. It's a direct witnessing into the nature of reality. And so there's a spiritual component. And he even tells us that he didn't come to this conclusion all by himself. It was a kind of a flash of insight that he had, of a spiritual, of a mystical kind of nature, that it's actually wujud which is fundamentally real. So he says that is the right answer. But there are two other possibilities, logically. So the first one is that it's quiddity which is more fundamentally real in the external world. The other position is that it's wujud which is fundamentally real in the external world. That's Mulla Sadra's position. He says the people that came before him, like Suhrawardi, his teacher Mir Damad, were upholding quiddity. The third position is what? Is that they're both. The only person I know who espoused this was a person named Sheikh Ahmed al-Ahsa'i. And then finally you could say, well, it's neither. I don't know anyone, certainly not in the Islamic world, who upheld that, but there is a kind of position, something like that, although the Buddhists, again, wouldn't talk this way. I mean, if we want to impose our terms on the Buddhists, I suppose, then you could say that, well, they uphold something like this, I suppose. But again, that's just not the way that Buddhists talk. The most philosophical among the Buddhists are the followers of the Tibetan school of Buddhism, the so-called Vajrayana Buddhists. I say they're the most philosophical because Buddhism had a tradition of philosophy that was carried on in Buddhist kind of seminaries in northern India in what is the current state of Bihar, and they no longer survive. Either they were destroyed by the Muslims when the Muslims took India, or were in northern India and took over major parts of northern India and established their polities there. So they often say, well, that's the major reason for the decline of Buddhism in India. Of course, there is another reason, which the more objective people will mention, is also the kind of backlash from the Vedantic school and people like Shankaracharya and so forth. So whatever the reasons, but there was a kind of philosophical tradition and debate and treatises very similar, to Islamic philosophy or, scholasticism in the medieval schools. But that thing didn't survive in India, but it was transferred to Tibet. People came study, and that thing survives there, and they consider themselves the heirs and the warithun of this kind of Nalanda Buddhism. So they have all these philosophical schools, and they discuss and they debate. And I'm originally from India, and since 1959, the Dalai Lama and many of the huge numbers of Tibetans have relocated to India. So it's easy to encounter them. So on my various visits to India, so I'm not just talking I've gone and actually talked to some people and asked them, what do you think of this? And but we really don't think this way. It's just like when Christians come and talk to us, if you take part in all these interfaith dialogues, they speak in a certain way and they ask a certain question, and then you say, well, okay, but we really don't think in those terms. So it's kind of unfair to say, well, this is maybe how the Buddhists would look at it. But one of the most profound scholars of Islamic philosophy was someone named Toshihiko Izutsu, who was Japanese. Izutsu wrote some really important works on Islamic philosophy, but he was a Zen Buddhist. And he was a kind of linguistic genius There's no exaggeration to say this. He started out studying linguistics, and he knew, according to different biographical accounts I've read of him, I never met him, but I have had students I have a student whose father was a student of his. I had a student whose father had been a student of his, and anyway. And so he confirmed, yes, that from his father that Izutsu knew something like more than 30 languages, 32, 33, 34 languages, yeah. So he's something like Anna Marie Schimmel, if you've heard of Anna Marie Schimmel. Anna Marie Schimmel also became a Muslim, apparently. She also knew a huge number of languages, and anyhow. So the point is that...
Anna Marie Schimmel, not quite sure. Became Muslim, not sure.
Well,
At least Murad Hoffman is based on his writings. He's close, you're pretty close, but not officially, at least.
Well, these are the kinds of things you hear, and fortunately we don't have to make those judgments.
Yeah, but that's not our business.
Fortunately, it's not.
I agree with you, but I just shared with you based on my...
No, I agree with you.
Murad Hoffman.
Yeah, Murad Hoffman can say what he likes. I mean, I never knew the woman. I have no idea, but her writings are really quite much more sympathetic than
Yes,
the people who would have been from her generation and background in Orientalism. So I'm just saying that Izutsu was a kind of linguistic prodigy, something like her. I think that's probably the only other example in Islamic studies that I could think of. My point is that so he knew these languages very well, and he has written some very interesting works. And probably one of the most interesting books in Islamic studies is called Sufism and Taoism, and that's by Izutsu. Sufism and Taoism, a study of key philosophical concepts, where he studies Ibn Arabi and he studies the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu, and he writes this 400-page book comparing them. It's a very serious book because he knows classical Chinese. I don't know anyone alive today who could do that. But he did write other things. He, along with an Iranian scholar, Mahdi Muhaqqiq, edited the first part of Mulla Hadi Sabzawari's summarization of the school of Al-Hikmat al-Muta'aliya. He did a critical edition of that in Arabic. It's called the Sharh Ghurr al-Fara'id, and he wrote a huge introduction to that. It's about more than 150 pages probably introduction, called The Metaphysics of Sabzavari, in which it's the metaphysics of Sabzavari, but it's really the metaphysics of Mulla Sadra, in which he explains at length the system. It's very interesting, very readable, and very well done. He also helped to critically edit this work of Mir Damad called the Kitab al-Qabasat, which is on this very, very thorny problem of the nature of the God-world, relationship and so forth. So Izutsu was very prolific. Now, Izutsu wrote a very interesting book, which originally was published in Iran, in English, called Towards the Philosophy of Zen Buddhism. And he makes a very perceptive remark there. He says that Islamic philosophy and Western traditional philosophy, of Aristotle, is a philosophy based on the distinction between substance and accident, between al-jawhar wal-arad. It's very important. He says, however...
Repeat the statement.
Islamic philosophy, and you could say, yes, classical Western philosophy, before modern times, is based on the distinction or division between essence and accident, or between jawhar and arad, between substance and accidents. Sometimes people use substance and essence to refer to the same thing. Is a huge problem. The terminology, always, you have to be careful. Okay, so he says it's based on the distinction of al-jawhar wal-arad. However, Buddhist philosophy, or Buddhist thought, Buddhist philosophy is based on the category of relation. So, the category or the predicament of relation. So you see, Aristotle has the so-called 10 categoria or predicamenta in Latin, the 10 categories or the 10 predicaments, of which the first is the jawhar or substance. And then you have the 9 kinds of accident, which are known as the predicaments. It's a very older way of saying it in English, which I quite like, because they are predicates. The predicaments, or if you like, the categories. And they are, gosh, what are they? There's quality, quantity, place. There's 9 of them. Well, one of them is relation, which is al-idafa. And so Buddhist philosophy is a relational philosophy, because they take emptiness, not nothingness, but the notion of emptiness, in Sanskrit shunyata, as being fundamental to the system. And so they say that, well, there really is no substance. Now, I'm putting it in our words. They don't use that word. But they're saying there's nothing really that we can call a substance in the external world. Because if I am presented with any substance, they often give the example of a table or something. So let's say we have these tables. So the table itself can be analyzed mentally into its tabletop and its chairs. And its legs. Or you could analyze a chair the same way. And you can continue this analysis into different elements that just exist in a kind of relationship to one another. But at the bottom and behind this relationship, there isn't anything. It's empty of substance. It's empty of what they call self-nature, for which they use the Sanskrit term Atma. But it's not Atma really in the sense of the Sanskrit term which you find in the Vedantic thought of soul. They're saying that really quiddities are not real. I'm translating again into our to terms more familiar to our kind of philosophical discourse than theirs. Their doctrine is the doctrine of anatma. And I have discussed this with different representatives of Buddhism that I have met informally, mind you. I didn't attend. Most of these official dialogues and so forth are kind of doomed from the start. It's personal contact when you meet people. When I was a graduate student at Princeton, there was a group of Tibetan monks who were there for some sort of Tibetan thing, and I found them in the coffee shop, actually, because they were making a sand mandala there. And there were some people there, and then one of them knew English, and then I asked, who is your leader, who is your hiring? I said, this guy. I said, this guy here that you were pointing to, is he a geshe? And geshe is the term for someone who's completed the whole course of studies in Tibetan, philosophical and so spiritual learning and teaching. He said, yes, actually he is. And I said, well, does he speak English? They said, no. I said, does he speak Hindi? He said, no. And I said, well, could you interpret for me? So this person interpreted for me, and that person's English wasn't very good. So then we switched to Urdu, Hindi, and then I asked my questions and so forth, and asked them lots of stuff. And essentially, and I drew some conclusions. And I have subsequently done this anytime I've gone to India or so forth and met people. And I've actually sought out some people and discussed this with them. So that really seems to be what they're espousing. And so in that sense, they're saying, well, but what in contradistinction to us, they don't just say, well, there's no substances there. There's no wujud either. Now that's why I say that it's something like that the fourth option, that it's neither, is something like Buddhist philosophy. And Allah knows best. All right?
So as per your
because they're not saying that it's wujud is fundamental. They're saying that emptiness is the fundamental reality of things. But all right, once you've negated, is there anything left? And that's where the problem comes. But it's a very, very deep debate or discussion to have with someone.
Don't the Buddhists have the doctrine of atomism?
Well, I mean, we can discuss all of this when we go further, and if we want to continue unofficially. I think they've made the adhan now, but we're going to go till 2, or can we? We
5
can.
minutes before 2.
We can stay 5. So we have about maybe 10 more minutes.
Does Tao also say the same thing?
Well, now Taoism is very interesting. It's a different kind of philosophy. It's very hard to interpret. I would say that if one knew Tibetan and Sanskrit, it would be easier to interpret the Buddhist text than it would be to interpret the Taoist text because Sanskrit and also Tibetan, these are very, very sort of grammatical languages. Sanskrit is a highly inflected language like Arabic. And my understanding is that Tibetan also has some aspects of this, but they've translated. There was a huge translation movement in which all sorts of texts from Sanskrit were translated back into Tibetan. So much so that many of those, I'm told that many, or certainly some of those texts no longer survive in Sanskrit, and they've been retranslated from Tibetan back into And apparently the translation was so good that it was easy to do this. Well, this is what I'm told. I don't know. I'm not an expert on those languages. But with classical Chinese, it's just, you kind of scratch your head and you wonder, how did people figure out this language? I don't know. It's something very, very different from our own linguistic experience, which is not to say I in no way endorse or espouse linguistic relativism. But these texts are very hard to interpret. So when you have something like the Tao Te Ching, excuse me, of Lao Tzu, the term Tao is very hard to interpret, and there are people who are against the idea that Tao is an absolute, because it's very easy to say, well, all right, well, we'll say Tao is the absolute, which is really, which is wujud, so he's talking about that. But is that really what Tao means? And there's doesn't seem to be any kind of word for God in Chinese in the way that we would say something like Allah. They have some notion of God, but typically they would use the word heaven or something like this. And these were serious problems, especially when the Christians went to China and they wanted to try to convert people there. And there's actually been studies of this, because the Jesuits apparently got there first, the Society of Jesus, the Catholics, and then they wanted to sort of translate the Bible, and they were looking for a word. And it's very interesting to read about all this. But there doesn't seem to be a doctrine there of the notion of emptiness that you find in Buddhism. So yes, that's all I can say. There seems to be in Taoism a notion of going beyond both existence and non-existence, something beyond being, something prior to being, not temporally but logically prior. You see, there seems to be this kind of a notion there. In that way, there's sort of like in Islam there is one group, but they're a highly unknown group and not much talked about, and people have all sorts of reservations. But you can read, discuss. That would be the Ismailis. The Ismailis have this idea of a completely transcendent God that is even beyond being. Now, I have my own interpretation of what is going on when in this kind of situation. And I'm happy to share that with you, and you can take it at face value. When you actually look into the school of Ibn Arabi, and you find elements of this also there in Mulla Sadra as well, that, when we talk about wujud, the wujud of God, absolute being, Allah is absolute, pure, sheer being. There is no composition in Him. He is utterly simple. So He has neither genus, nor species, nor specific difference, nor parts of any kind. And ultimately, in the ultimate sense of the reality of wujud, of Allah, in fact, even to say of Allah, it's just superfluous. Ultimate being is Allah. Okay? And ultimate being, in the absolute, most absolute sense, and here language begins to really push the limit. We push the limits of language here. Then wujud is beyond all determinations. It is beyond all qualifications. It is beyond being conditioned of any kind. And in fact, it is even beyond the condition of being non-conditioned. So that's when you get to the divine essence. We cannot say anything about the divine essence. And there are hadiths that tell us not to try and understand the divine essence because we're not going to get anywhere. So when you speak of wujud as utterly unconditioned, utterly non-conditioned, and I don't mean negatively conditioned. There's a difference between negatively conditioned and non-conditioned. Negatively conditioned is a kind of what's known as the negative theology, it's also called with a fancy word apophatic theology, where we cannot say anything about God, but we can say what He is not. So that would be God, or even wujud, conceived of as negatively conditioned. That's in Arabic called al-wujud bi sharti la. La meaning no, negation. So negatively conditioned being.
So you're conditioning absences.
Mm-hmm. Negatively, yes.
It's a form of conditioning. I mean,
It's negatively conditioned. But now we have what's called al-wujud. That's above this is al-wujud la bishart. Utterly non-conditioned being, so much so that it is even beyond the condition of being non-conditioned. Here we cannot say anything. That's what the Ismailis have in mind. That's what the Buddhists have in mind. But the moment you put it in those terms, they say, no, we don't believe in God. It's kind of like, and you probably have experience with this living in this epic community, whatever, that you guys are a part of these dialogues with the Christians constantly. What do you always come up against when you dialogue with Christians? The Trinity, right? Original sin. There's certain things where there's really, people tend to shut down. The Christians are going to shut down when you deny Trinity, and the Muslims are going to shut down when Trinity is argued for. When you talk to Buddhists, they don't like to, especially Western Buddhists, people who are Westerners who've converted to Buddhism because they're trying to get away from theistic religion. And so they love to say that Buddhism is an atheistic religion. There's really no absolute. We're, as Buddhists, we are trying to go to the non-conditioned. We want to go to beyond absolutes. There is no absolutes. So they have all of these kind of things. And so when you talk to them, and they say, no, well, we don't really espouse this kind of thing. But if words have any kind of meaning, if philosophy has any kind of meaning, this is the conclusion that I've come to, that they are really talking about the utterly non-conditioned. And this is another reason I'm fascinated by Izutsu, because Izutsu saw this framework of wahdatul wujud, or philosophies based on wujud, but he specifically said wahdatul wujud. He saw this particularly in the very philosophical interpretation of it that you find in the school of Ibn Arabi, which again comes into Mulla Sadra. He saw this as a kind of meta-philosophy for understanding world philosophy. That's why he was really interested in Islamic philosophy. And he wrote an essay on this. He wrote some sort of a work. I don't think it's just an essay. I think it's an actual monograph of some kind, but it's in Japanese. And I don't know Japanese. I've never been able to find anyone who's translated it or is willing to translate it. And when I was a student a professor at American University in Cairo, I had a student from Japan, very, very good student, one of the best I've had, a chap by the name of Makoto Sawai. His father had studied New Izutsu. His father's a specialist in Sanskrit and had actually studied at Harvard, and Makoto was doing Islamic studies. But he had read Izutsu's thing on that, and sometimes we would talk about it. Anyway.
Could you repeat that? The meta-philosophy? Or the meta...
A meta-philosophy. Yeah, he has an essay on this, though, in English, but I'm told that the larger sort of work of Izutsu on this is in Japanese. But he wrote a number of his essays were collected together and published under the title Creation and the Timeless Order of Things. And in that he has a couple of essays. And one of them is called as Wahdatul Wujud, as a meta-philosophy for world philosophies. And it's very interesting then when you do that and try and understand, let's say, Buddhist thought, Buddhist philosophy, Vedantic philosophy, and of course the best example of Izutsu's idea in practice is his book on Taoism. And so in Taoism, that was your original question, we also have this kind of situation where you have the Tao is somehow beyond being and non-being. Yeah. And then the words that they use are interesting. So for example, in Buddhism, the word that they use for emptiness, for shunyata, that's of course a Sanskrit word. It really is that which is empty, but when they translate into Chinese, and the Chinese character which they would also use in Japanese, they don't use the Japanese pronunciation would be mu, in Chinese it would be wu. They don't use that character. They use the character which would be pronounced in Japanese as ku, or in Chinese probably as kung. And that means empty. It's also pronounced in Japanese as kara. The Japanese pronunciation, the pure Japanese pronunciation is kara, and that's where you get karate, empty hand. So it's very interesting when you get into this. And I remember I met on my one and only trip to Iran, when I attended a conference there in 2003. It was a beautiful visit. I met a Japanese scholar named Shigeru Kamada. So Professor Kamada had translated one of the works of Mulla Sadra into Japanese. And I asked him, I said, well, Professor Kamada, how do you translate the Arabic term Adam into when you translate it in Japanese? And he said immediately, I translated it as ku. I said, you didn't use mu. He said, no. Mu would be wrong here. It is ku. And ku is empty, and mu is is negation, nothing. So in Zen Buddhism, they have the notion of mu shin, no mind or empty mind, with this state where you're not really focused on what, and it's important in martial arts, because if you are focused on the idea of killing the other guy or being killed, then it's a problem. You have to be focused on neither of those. So they talk about mushin and this and that, but that's not what he used. So I thought that was absolutely fascinating. So the fourth option, where you negate either, that's essentially, I think, what it comes down to. Because you cannot really say that there is no being. That commits you to a sophist position, what we call safsata in classical Arabic. So it works on philosophy and hikmah, that this idea that, well, there's really nothing. It's just there's no truth. It commits you to, it leads to absurdities. I think really that's what's going on in Buddhist philosophy, and there's some variations of that in the Chinese, in answer to your question. And I think there are some resonances or similarities there also in the notion of the God beyond the chain of being, so to speak, in Ismailism. And there's actually a paper on that by Madilung, which has some title like that, about the God beyond being in Ismaili theology. Yes?
So emptiness in the Buddhist term mean the absence of being, and quiddity, or it's a state?
No, they're saying that if you talk about any individual thing, it does not really exist from its own side. It's just a concatenation of different elements, and we with our mind assign it a kind of unity and a concrete reality which it actually isn't entitled to, and that it doesn't have. So, but the thing is, with Buddhism, it doesn't really start out, and again, we're on a kind of fuzzy historical ground here, because when you talk about Indic religions, it's not like Islamic history where we actually have dates. I understand there's some differences in the dates, and we're not sure about an exact chronology of the battle campaigns of the Prophet ﷺ, but we have dates for our major figures, especially once Islam is there and the Hijra calendar is adopted in the year 16 of the Hijra by Umar ibn al-Khattab, becomes official. After that, it's pretty solid. Because they don't know when Nagarjuna lived. They don't know when the Buddha lived, right? Historically, it's a big problem. But it would seem, if we just take the Pali Canon, for example, these of what is there in Buddhism, and all of these different Buddhist groups, whether it's the Vajrayana, which is the Tibetan sort of school of Buddhism, also has some kind of thing in Japan as well, known as Shingon in Japanese, but then your Theravada Buddhists and your Mahayana Buddhists, they all agree on the basic teaching of the Buddha. And what is that? Well, it's not really a metaphysics so much as it is a psychology. He is really immediately trying to deal with the problem of suffering. Why do people suffer? And the idea is, well, because of attachment. We are attached, and we need to become unattached. How are we going to become unattached? We realize that it's not as the things that we are attached to are not really as important as they are. Why are they not as important as they are? Because they are empty. They're empty of self-nature. Similarly, you must empty yourself of self-nature. There has to be a kind of self-knotting, a kind of ascesis and asceticism that has to be practiced. And when you truly realize the emptiness of phenomenon, it's only then that you can really have true compassion for other living things, which is not based on your own sentimentalities and so on and so forth. So this is how they argue. It's not really a pure metaphysical problem that you find in Aristotle or Ibn Sina or so forth. They have a different approach to things. And when you approach things differently, there will be different emphasis. But I think there is value in this kind of inquiry when you think carefully, when you don't condemn the other side, and you really try and understand then you can come to some very, very profound insights, which I think are truly precious. At any rate, I think we need to stop here. It's 5 minutes to 2, and then we'll pick up with the more substantive doctrines of Mulla Sadra when we come back. Thank you very much.
We have 2 more hours, so we're going to have 2